The evening had started as usual, with the faint scent of the dinner Stella had cooked still present in the kitchen. Jamie sat at the table, his hands clasping a mug of coffee that had long been cold. The crackling of the wood in the fireplace broke the quiet, a sound that normally comforted him, but tonight it only seemed to make the stillness more profound. He gazed at the mug, deep in thought, his mind roaming through the routine details of the day. The noise of footsteps interrupted his reverie. He looked up, expecting to see Stella, but something about the way she walked into the room captured his attention. Her steps were careful, each one deliberate, as if she were shouldering a great weight. She rested against the counter, her eyes locked on him, searching his face for any clue to what he might be thinking. "Jamie," she started, her tone resolute but tinged with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. He looked up at her, a flicker of worry in his eyes. "What's wrong, Stella?" he inquired, his voice stable, though a trace of discomfort had started to infiltrate his thoughts. She paused, as if unsure whether to proceed with what she had intended. The silence between them grew. Jamie sensed the tension, though he couldn't pinpoint its origin. Eventually, Stella took a deep breath and seemed to brace herself. "There's someone I need you to meet," she declared, her words more forceful than she probably intended. Jamie's forehead wrinkled in puzzlement. "Meet someone? What do you mean?" His voice held a hint of suspicion, although he tried to maintain a neutral tone. Without waiting for his reply, Stella turned her head slightly, indicating the doorway. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim kitchen light. Jamie narrowed his eyes as he observed the man now standing before him, a tall, robust individual whose presence seemed to fill the room. "This is Alex," Stella said, her voice now stronger, as though she had committed to her decision. "He'll be living with us from now on." Jamie's hold on the mug tightened, the words struck him like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't process what she had just announced. "Living with us," he echoed, his voice flat, revealing none of the turmoil that had started to stir within him. Stella didn't flinch. "I want you to accept sharing me with him," she stated bluntly, her arms folded across her chest in a defiant stance. "You don't have a choice, Jamie. If you object," she hesitated, and for the first time, Jamie noticed a glint of doubt in her eyes. "Alex will hurt you." Jamie sat motionless, his mind scrambling to assimilate the new reality that had been imposed on him. He shifted his gaze from Stella to Alex, who stood quietly, a conceited grin on his face. The tension in the room was tangible, each second feeling like an eternity. The suppressed anger within Jamie started to seethe, but he maintained his composure. Silently, he pushed his chair back, the wooden legs, scraping against the floor, echoed ominously. He stood up slowly, his gaze never leaving Alex's. The silence was overwhelming as Jamie turned and walked out of the kitchen. His footsteps reverberated along the hallway, each step careful and calculated. Stella watched him leave, her heart pounding, uncertain of his next move. She had braced for anger, possibly shouting or tears, but not this unsettling, controlled silence. Alex sneered, evidently pleased by the discomfort he had caused. "See, I told you he wouldn't confront me," he boasted, his tone full of scorn. However, Stella didn't reply. She was consumed by a sense of dread, feeling that something was profoundly amiss with the way Jamie had departed, his calmness unnerving. Her thoughts raced with countless dreadful possibilities, each more frightening than the last. The noise of footsteps interrupted her again as Jamie returned. She turned towards the doorway, her breath halting in anticipation as she saw him re-enter the room. His face was expressionless, but his eyes held a newfound severity. Clutched in his hand was something that chilled her to the bone, a hunting knife, its blade shining under the kitchen's soft lighting. "Jamie, what are you?" Stella began, her voice shaking, but her words faltered as she caught the look on his face. Before she could react, Jamie moved with unexpected speed and precision, surprising both her and Alex. He closed the gap between himself and Alex instantly, the knife slicing through the air with lethal intent. Alex's confident smirk disappeared as he realized the danger, but it was too late. Jamie's initial attack was rapid and harsh, the blade cutting across Alex's arm. The man bellowed in pain, reeling back while clutching his bleeding wound, his blood staining the floor. The gravity of the situation dawned on him. This was not going to be a simple confrontation. Stella screamed, a sound mixed with fear and astonishment. She staggered back, her hands covering her mouth as she witnessed the scene in terror. "Jamie, stop." "What are you doing?" she cried, but Jamie was unresponsive. His attention was solely on Alex, his actions deliberate and ruthless. He attacked again, targeting Alex's torso. In desperation, Alex threw a punch, but it barely affected Jamie, merely grazing his shoulder. Jamie's grip on the knife tightened. His actions were swift and precise. Alex, caught off guard, stepped back, his eyes wide with shock, but the knife struck faster, and he cried out in agony as it inflicted a deep cut. "You think you can just barge into my house and threaten me?" Jamie hissed, his voice low and threatening. He advanced, his eyes fixed on Alex, his demeanor showing no hesitation, just calculated anger. Alex, struggling to control the bleeding, shifted from shock to anger. "You're insane," he spat, his voice tinged with pain and disbelief. "Jamie, stop!" Stella screamed again, her voice filled with panic as she moved towards him, her hand extended as if to halt the escalating violence. Alex, regaining some composure, used his larger build to his advantage and tackled Jamie, sending them both crashing into the wall. The impact knocked the knife from Jamie's grasp, sending it skittering across the floor, just out of immediate reach. For a moment, it seemed Alex might gain the upper hand as he pressed Jamie against the wall, his face contorted with rage. "You're nothing," Alex sneered, his voice full of scorn, his breath hot against Jamie's face. "Just a pathetic loser who couldn't satisfy his wife." Jamie's eyes narrowed, his mind quickly assessing the situation, searching for a chance to regain control. His eyes flicked to the knife a few feet away. Knowing he needed to act quickly before Alex could inflict further damage, he summoned a surge of strength, driven by adrenaline, and shoved Alex off him. Alex staggered, taken aback by the force. Seizing the moment, Jamie dove for the knife, his fingers wrapping around the handle, just as Alex regained his footing and charged again. This time, Jamie was prepared as Alex approached. Jamie twisted, raising the knife in a swift, ruthless motion. The knife plunged into Alex's side with a sickening thud. Alex gasped, his momentum propelling him forward as the blade ripped through his flesh and muscle. His eyes widened in shock, the agony striking him like a freight train. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The only sound was Alex's labored breathing, each breath a battle as he grasped the wound, his hand coming back slick with blood. He stumbled backward, his strength fading with every passing moment. Stella screamed once more, her shriek high-pitched and frantic, slicing through the tension. She rushed to Alex, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands shook as she attempted to apply pressure to the wound, but the blood continued to flow, staining her hands and pooling on the floor below them. "Oh my God, Jamie, what have you done?" she cried, her voice cracking as she looked up at her husband. Her eyes were wide with horror and disbelief, as if unable to grasp what had just occurred. Jamie stood over them, his chest rising and falling with the exertion from the altercation. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched as the life slowly drained from Alex. His face showed no pleasure, no victory, just a stark, unyielding determination. Alex tried to speak, but the words got caught in his throat. His body was succumbing, the pain too overpowering. His gaze moved from Jamie to Stella, seeking some kind of solace, a final comfort, but there was nothing she could offer him now. "What I should have done the moment you dishonored our marriage," Jamie finally stated, his tone sharp and firm. He looked down at Stella, meeting her tear-filled eyes. There was no sympathy in his stare, no remorse, just the stark reality of what needed to be done. Stella shook her head, still unable to comprehend the situation. "We need to call an ambulance," she murmured, her voice shaking. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers slick with blood, but her hands trembled too much to dial. "Jamie, please, he's dying," she insisted, but Jamie remained motionless, watching solemnly. Stella wrestled with the phone, her desperation mounting with each failed attempt, but it was too late to reverse what had been done. He had made his decision, and so had she. "You brought him here," Jamie said softly, his voice composed yet frosty. "You brought this upon yourself." Stella finally managed to dial the emergency number, but she knew it was futile. The blood was escaping from Alex's wound too rapidly, surrounding them, staining her clothes, her hands, the floor. She pressed her palms harder against the wound, but it was akin to trying to stop a flood. "Stay with me," Alex, Stella pleaded, her voice filled with urgency. "Help is on the way, just hold on." But Alex didn't respond. His eyes were glassy, his body weakening further with each second. He tried to focus on her, but his vision was dimming, the world around him fading away. His grip on her hand loosened, his head slumping forward. "Jamie, do something," Stella cried, looking up at her husband, her face a portrait of fear and desperation. "We can't just let him die." But Jamie didn't reply. He simply stood there, watching as Alex's life ebbed away. In his mind, this was the only possible conclusion. There was no saving Alex, no salvaging his marriage. The betrayal had inflicted wounds too deep, leaving scars that could never mend. The sound of sirens pierced the silence, growing louder as they neared. Stella's heart pounded, hope and fear intertwined. She looked back at Alex, but his eyes were now closed, his breathing shallow and erratic. The vitality that had once animated him, the arrogance and bravado, had vanished, replaced by a lifeless husk. "Jamie, please," Stella whispered, her voice barely audible, but there was nothing more to say. The door swung open as paramedics entered swiftly, their actions rapid and precise. They moved Stella aside, quickly assessing Alex's state with serious expressions. One paramedic called for additional help, the urgency in his voice clear. But despite their efforts, it was evident to all present that it was too late. Stella observed in stunned silence as the paramedics worked to stabilize Alex, their movements skilled and exact. Yet, from their exchanged looks and subtle headshakes, it was apparent they were struggling against the inevitable. Jamie stepped back to give them room, but his gaze remained fixed on Alex. He watched as the paramedics placed him on a stretcher, the blood-soaked sheets a stark contrast to his pale skin. They acted swiftly, yet their motions carried a sense of finality, an air of inevitability that filled the room. Stella attempted to follow as they wheeled Alex out of the house, but a paramedic gently stopped her. "Ma'am, you need to stay here," he advised calmly but firmly. "We're doing all we can," she nodded, too overwhelmed to protest, her eyes tracking the stretcher as it vanished through the door. The house fell eerily silent in the aftermath, the distant wail of the ambulance as it sped away the only sound. Jamie stood in the center of the room, his breathing heavy, his mind replaying the recent events. He realized there would be consequences for his actions, but he felt indifferent. The fury that had driven him had dissipated, replaced by a cold clarity. Stella faced him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice small and fragile. Jamie looked at her, his face expressionless. "I'm going to tell them the truth," he replied, his voice steady. "Then we'll see what happens." Stella nodded, the gravity of the situation heavy on her heart. There was no turning back now. They had crossed a line that could never be undone, and the repercussions would follow them for the rest of their lives. The house, once filled with the chaos of conflict, now lay in unsettling silence, broken only by Stella's muffled sobs as she knelt beside Alex, futilely pressing her hands against the wound that continued to bleed, staining the floor beneath them. Alex's breathing was labored, each gasp shallower than the last. Jamie stood a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the scene, his grip on the knife loosened, but his body still tense. He watched Stella, his emotions a tangled web. Deep down, part of him felt a dark satisfaction he had defended his pride, his home. Yet another part, the part that had loved Stella for years, felt nothing but a profound, gnawing emptiness. Stella Jamie finally spoke, his voice softer now, the anger that had fueled him fading into a more complex, more painful emotion. Stella looked up at him, her face tear-streaked, a mix of fear, guilt, and regret in her expression. Her voice was barely audible as she choked out her response. I don't know, Jamie. I was bored. I was lonely, I thought. I thought you wouldn't care. I wanted the attention." Jamie let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "You thought I wouldn't care? You were my world, Stella. I gave you everything, and you threw it away for this." He gestured toward Alex, who was now barely conscious, his life ebbing with each passing second. Stella couldn't meet his gaze, crushed by the weight of her betrayal. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but even as she spoke, she knew the words were empty. What could an apology mean now, after everything that had happened? Jamie's gaze returned to Alex, the man drifting in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow and strained. There was a time, perhaps just an hour ago, when Jamie might have felt pity or guilt, but now all he felt was cold detachment. He was aware that Alex wouldn't last much longer without medical attention, but he found himself indifferent. "You've made your bed," Stella Jamie said icily, his tone hardening as the gravity of the situation dawned on him. "Now lie in it without another word." Jamie turned and left the room. Stella's cries intensified, but he didn't pause. He stepped out into the crisp night air, the door closing behind him with a gentle click. The quiet of the outside world stood in stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging within him. The burden he had carried, the doubt, the anger, the pain seemed to lift, replaced by an unusual sense of clarity. Jamie walked down the porch steps, his steps taking him to the boundary of the property. The night was calm, the stars twinkling in the clear sky above, indifferent to the chaos that had unfolded below. He stood there for a moment, taking deep breaths, trying to comprehend what had just occurred. The adrenaline that had propelled him during the altercation was dissipating, leaving a void of emptiness in his chest. As he gazed into the darkness, memories of his life with Stella flashed before him, the early days of their love, the laughter, the plans they had made for the future. It all seemed so distant now, as if it had happened to someone else. The woman inside that house sobbing over her dying lover was not the Stella he had once known, or perhaps she was, and he had simply been too blind to see it. He reflected on the past few months, how she had grown distant, how the light in her eyes had dimmed. He had noticed, of course, but had convinced himself it was just a temporary phase, that their love was strong enough to endure anything. But now, standing in the cool night air, he realized how mistaken he had been. His thoughts were interrupted by the distant wail of sirens. The paramedics would arrive soon, and they would take Alex away, attempting to save him. But Jamie knew it was too late. The damage was irreversible. He turned and looked back at the house, the soft illumination of its lights spilling onto the lawn. For a moment he contemplated going back inside, checking on Stella, seeing if anything was left to salvage. But then he recalled the indifference in her voice when she had introduced Alex, the way she had regarded him with something akin to disdain. No, there was nothing left for him in that house. The life he had known was over, and there was no returning. Jamie walked to the end of the driveway, his steps measured and intentional. He could hear the sirens growing louder, but he felt no urgency. The authorities would arrive, they would ask questions, and he would tell them the truth. There was no point in concealing it. He had done what he felt necessary to defend himself, his home, his dignity. As he reached the end of the driveway, he stopped and looked back one last time. The house stood silent and still, a testament to the life he had lost. A twinge of regret passed through him, but it was swiftly engulfed by the crisp clarity that had settled over him. The sirens were now loud, almost upon him. Jamie took a deep breath, steadying himself. He was uncertain of what the future held, but he was prepared to face it directly, just as he had faced the night's events. The flashing lights appeared at the end of the street, and Jamie stood there waiting for them. As the ambulance and police cars pulled into the driveway, a strange sense of calm enveloped him. He had confronted the worst and survived. Now all that remained was to manage the consequences. The paramedics rushed past him, barely acknowledging his presence, as they hurried into the house. Jamie watched them go. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was calm as the police approached him, their expressions serious, yet he didn't flinch. He was prepared. "Sir, we need to ask you some questions," one of the officers said, his voice firm but not harsh. Jamie nodded. "I'll tell you everything," he replied quietly, his voice steady. There was no reason to lie, no reason to try to hide what had happened. The truth was evident, displayed on the blood-stained floor of his home. As he stood there under the flashing lights of the police cars, Jamie realized this was the start of something new. The past was irreparably broken, but the future, whatever it might hold, was his to shape. As the officer escorted him to the car, Jamie took one last look at the house, now bustling with paramedics and police. He knew he would never return, never again enter those doors, and that was okay. It was time to move forward, to leave the past behind. Jamie closed his eyes as he settled into the back of the police car, feeling the weight of the night lift from his shoulders. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. The days following the incident passed in a blur. The arrival of the police had marked the end of the nightmare that had unraveled in Jamie's home. Alex was dead by the time they had arrived, a casualty of the turmoil he had unwittingly entered. The officers had taken Jamie into custody, handcuffing him as Stella's frantic cries filled the house. Her face showed horror and disbelief, but Jamie felt nothing as he was led away. The storm had come, and now it was over. Jamie sat in the stark, cold interrogation room, waiting for his lawyer to arrive. The room was plain, the walls a dull grey, the furniture functional but uncomfortable. He stared at the one-way mirror, aware of the eyes on him, evaluating, judging. Yet he felt strangely detached from it all, as if the events had happened to someone else. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman known for winning tough cases, eventually arrived. She listened to his account, her expression unreadable, then nodded, assuring him that they would argue it was a case of self-defense. The legal battle that ensued was intense. The prosecution depicted him as a jealous, violent husband who had lost control, while his defense maintained he had acted in self-defense, pushed to the edge by betrayal and a direct threat to his life. Stella testified, her voice shaky as she described the events of that night. Jamie could see the guilt in her eyes, but she never looked directly at him. In the end, the evidence or the lack thereof worked in his favor. Alex had entered Jamie's home uninvited and had threatened him. In the ensuing struggle, Jamie had done what he felt necessary. The charges were dropped and Jamie walked out of the courthouse a free man, but the ordeal had left him drained, both mentally and physically. Stella didn't fare as well. The affair and the violence that had followed became the talk of the town. Once a respected wife known for her poise and grace, she was now the subject of scandal and whispers. The judgment from those who had once been her friends was harsh and unforgiving. Unable to face the humiliation, she packed her bags and left town, disappearing without a trace. Jamie heard from mutual friends that Stella had moved to another state, but he didn't ask for details. He understood that part of his life was definitively over. As the months passed, Jamie found himself at a crossroads. The house where he and Stella had made countless memories, both joyful and painful, no longer felt like home. Each corner, every room echoed a life that was now past. It was overwhelming, the weight of the past stifling him. So, he decided to sell the house, leaving behind the ghosts of his former life, and bought a small cabin in the mountains, far from the town where everything had fallen apart. The cabin was secluded, nestled among tall trees and the calming sounds of nature, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts, away from the scrutinizing eyes and judgmental stares of others. The first few weeks were tough. The silence was oppressive, and memories of that fateful night haunted him, replaying endlessly in his mind. However, gradually, the serene solitude of the mountains began to mend him. Jamie settled into a straightforward routine. He spent his mornings hiking through the lush forest, enjoying the cool mountain air on his skin and the sound of the ground crunching beneath his boots. In the afternoons, he would fish in the nearby river, his mind concentrated solely on the line and the water, a welcome distraction from his lingering thoughts. Evenings were spent by the fire, the warmth of the flames comforting as he sipped on a cup of coffee or a glass of whiskey. This simpler life brought him a peace he hadn't felt in years. There were no expectations, no pressures, just him, the mountains, and the silence. Slowly but surely the memories of Stella and Alex began to fade, their hold on him weakening with each passing day. He no longer woke up in a cold sweat, haunted by nightmares. Instead, he found himself eagerly anticipating each new day, the tranquility and the solitude that had become his refuge. One evening, as he sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker, Jamie realized something for the first time in what felt like forever. He was content. He had navigated through the darkest times of his life, and although he had come out scarred, he had also become stronger. The betrayal, the violence, the loss, it was all behind him now, a part of his past that he had finally put to rest. As the fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the small cabin, Jamie allowed himself a smile. He had taken back control of his life, reclaimed his sense of self. The man who had once been shattered by betrayal had rebuilt himself, piece by piece, in the quiet solitude of the mountains. He had found a new beginning, a chance to live life on his own terms, free from the shadows of the past. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Jamie wasn't afraid of what it might hold. He had faced the worst and had survived. Now, as he gazed into the dancing flames, he saw not just the end of a chapter, but the beginning of a new one. The past was behind him, and the future, whatever it might bring, was his to shape.